Disaster Relief Coordinator Bethany Wells stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately recognized the universal smell of a very bad day that had gotten significantly worse. "Welcome to Facility Omega-9, said a harried alien with too many arms and not nearly enough emotional stability. "I am Administrator Kelthon. Thank you for responding to our situation." Bethany shouldered her emergency response kit and looked around at what appeared to be the aftermath of someone's particularly creative interpretation of interior design, using body parts as the primary medium. "Standard post-conflict cleanup?" she asked, consulting her work orders. "The translation matrix may have simplified the terminology. How simplified are we talking?" Kelthon's multiple eyes blinked in what she was learning to recognize as the alien equivalent of someone trying to figure out how to explain that the job was significantly more complicated than advertised. "Perhaps you should observe the situation before we proceed with technical classifications." They walked through corridors that looked like someone had tried to redecorate using a food processor and no particular sense of aesthetic restraint. Bodies were scattered with the kind of artistic randomness that suggested whoever did this had watched too many slasher films and taken notes. "Definitely not standard cleanup," Bethany observed. "This is more of a crime scene meets abstract art installation situation." The facility housed a research center and nursery for Vorthek apex predator development. Housed, past tense. I'm getting that. The attack was comprehensive. Bethany paused at what appeared to be a particularly creative arrangement of former researchers around what might have once been a conference table. "Someone really didn't like the quarterly reports," she said dryly. "I beg your pardon?" "Never mind. Earth humor. We tend to get sarcastic when faced with apocalyptic carnage. It's a coping mechanism." They continued through the facility, past scenes that would have made horror movie directors weep with envy. Bethany cataloged each area with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen enough disasters to know that freaking out didn't help anybody. The perpetrators were identified as a Krathny elimination squad, Kelthon explained. They targeted this facility for ideological reasons. Let me guess. Someone disagreed with the research methodology and decided to express their concerns through interpretive murder? That is, not entirely inaccurate. They reached what had been the facility's nursery area. The carnage here was even more thorough, if that was possible. Adult Vorthok were scattered around equipment that looked like it had been designed by someone who confused childcare with military training. The juveniles were the primary target, Kelthon said quietly. The attack was designed to eliminate the next generation. Charming. Nothing says philosophical, says. Disagreement quite like murdering kids. Bethany was conducting her standard assessment when she heard it. A sound that was barely audible but definitely biological. Something was still alive in this charnel house. "We have survivors," she announced. "Impossible. The attack was comprehensive, you mentioned, but someone forgot to check their work." She followed the sound to what appeared to be a reinforced supply closet. Inside, pressed against the back wall like they were trying to disappear into the metal itself, were 6 creatures that looked like someone had crossed house cats with motorcycles and given the result anxiety disorders. "Well, hello there," she said quietly. 6 pairs of amber eyes stared at her with the kind of shell-shocked awareness that she'd seen too many times in disaster zones. These were kids who'd just watched their entire world end in the most violent way possible. "The juveniles," Kelthon whispered. "They survived. Barely. Look at them." The cubs were pressed together in a huddle that spoke of creatures seeking comfort in the only warmth left in a suddenly cold universe. They were trembling, not with cold, but with the kind of trauma that rewrote neural pathways. "They have been exposed to significant psychological damage," Kelthon said. "They've been exposed to watching everyone they knew get murdered. That tends to leave a mark." Bethany crouched down to make herself less threatening and spoke in the calm, matter-of-fact tone she'd learned worked best with disaster survivors. "Hey kids, I know today's been pretty much the worst day ever, but the good news is it's almost over." The cubs shifted slightly. One of them made a sound that might have been a whimper. "I'm Bethany. I'm here to help figure out what comes next. And I know that right now, what comes next probably seems pretty terrifying." But here's the thing about really bad days. They make all the regular bad days look like vacation. Behind her, she could hear Kelthon making sounds that suggested he was having difficulty processing her approach to trauma counseling. The juveniles require specialized psychological intervention, he said. Trained professionals in apex predator behavioral therapy. The juveniles require someone who's not going to treat them like broken equipment, Bethany replied. They're kids who just lived through hell. They don't need therapy. They need someone to acknowledge that hell sucks, and it's okay to be pissed off about it. One of the cubs looked directly at her. The intelligence in those amber eyes was sharp enough to cut, but there was something else there too. Curiosity about this strange creature who talked about hell like it was a scheduling inconvenience. You know what the worst part about surviving something like this is? She continued conversationally. Everyone expects you to be grateful. Like somehow making it through the apocalypse means you should send thank you cards. Another cub shifted position. Still wary, but listening. But here's what I learned from surviving a few apocalypses of my own. The universe doesn't owe you a good day. It doesn't owe you a bad day either. It just owes you whatever day you get, and then it's up to you to decide what to do with it. This is highly irregular, Kelthon said. Standard protocols for trauma survivors require that someone who's never been through hell explain to people who just lived through it how they're supposed to feel about it. Bethany cut him off. I prefer the direct approach. She reached into her emergency kit and pulled out a ration bar, the kind of nutritionally complete, taste-free survival food that kept people alive when nothing else was available. Anyone hungry? I know trauma kills the appetite, but trust me, you'll feel marginally less awful if you eat something. The smallest cub made a sound that might have been interest. Good choice. Food is one of those things that helps convince your brain that maybe the world isn't completely ending. As she broke the ration bar into smaller pieces, she continued her running commentary on survival philosophy. See, the thing about really bad days is they give you perspective. Like, tomorrow when something minor goes wrong, say the replicator breaks or someone uses all the hot water, you can look at it and think, well, at least nobody's trying to murder me with farming equipment. One of the cubs made a sound that was almost like laughter. Almost. There we go. Gallows humor. It's like regular humor, but with more existential dread and fewer punchlines. Kelthon was making increasingly distressed sounds. Dr. Wells, this approach is completely contrary to established trauma recovery protocols. Dr. Wells, established trauma recovery protocols are written by people who've never had to clean brain matter off their shoes, Bethany replied. Sometimes what works is acknowledging that life is fundamentally absurd, frequently unfair, and occasionally completely insane. The cubs were definitely listening now. Still traumatized, still wary, but engaged with someone who wasn't trying to explain away their experience or minimize what they'd been through. So here's my professional assessment, Bethany said, settling in for what was clearly going to be a long conversation. Today was objectively terrible. Tomorrow will probably be better, but only because it would be mathematically difficult for it to be worse. And for the first time since she'd found them, all 6 cubs were looking at her with something that might eventually become hope, if they were patient and lucky and willing to accept that sometimes the best you could do was acknowledge that the world was crazy and try to find the humor in it. Behind her, Administrator Kelthon was probably having the kind of administrative crisis that would require forms in triplicate, but Bethany had 6 traumatized kids to worry about, and forms had never saved anyone's sanity. Now then, she said, let's talk about what we're going to do with the rest of this spectacularly awful day. 3 days into what Bethany had started calling Operation Make Traumatized Kids Slightly Less Traumatized, she found herself being observed by more alien psychologists than she'd known existed. Subject continues to employ non-standard therapeutic interventions, reported Dr. Vesandra from her monitoring station. Current methodology appears to involve deliberate acknowledgement of mortality. She's telling them death is normal, Bethany translated, not looking up from the art therapy session she'd improvised using debris from the massacre. Which it is. Shocking concept, I know. The cubs were creating what could generously be called sculptures using twisted metal and other remnants of their former lives. The results looked like abstract representations of trauma, which was probably healthier than pretending everything was fine. The juveniles are demonstrating unprecedented engagement with their traumatic experience, Dr. Liskoth observed. Traditional protocols call for avoidance-based healing. Traditional protocols are written by people who've never had to help someone process watching their entire family get murdered with farm equipment, Bethany replied, helping the smallest cub, who'd started responding to Pip, attach a particularly meaningful piece of debris to his sculpture. But your approach encourages direct confrontation with traumatic memories. My approach acknowledges that traumatic memories happened, and pretending they didn't won't make them go away. The cubs had developed their own routine over the past few days. They'd wake up, spend some time being quietly devastated by the reality of their situation, then gradually engage with whatever activity Bethany had planned that involved acknowledging their new reality without sugarcoating it. "Tell me about this piece," Bethany said to Nova, the largest cub, who was working on something that looked like a memorial constructed from broken weapons. "It's for Instructor Kethmar," he said in his careful standard. "He used to say we were too soft to survive. Then he got killed by people with sharp things while we hid in a closet." "Ah, irony sculpture. Very advanced artistic concept. What is irony?" "It's when the universe has a sense of humor, but not a very nice one." Nova made a sound that might have been laughter. "The universe has a mean sense of humor." "The universe has a terrible sense of humor," Bethany agreed. "It's like a cosmic comedian who only knows one joke, and the joke is usually on you." From the observation deck, she could hear the sound of frantic note-taking. "Dr. Wells?" came Administrator Kelthon's voice through the intercom. "The psychological evaluation team has some concerns about your methodology." "Let me guess. They're concerned that I'm not pretending everything is going to be magically better if we just think positive thoughts. They are concerned that your approach may cause additional psychological damage." Bethany looked at the cubs, who were listening to the conversation with obvious interest. They'd gotten good at reading the adults' anxiety levels over the past few days. "Kids," she said, "what do you think? Am I making you more damaged by talking about how your situation objectively sucks?" "You're making us feel less crazy," said Luna, who was working on what appeared to be an abstract representation of existential dread. "The other adults keep trying to tell us we'll be fine. We don't feel fine." "And when someone tells you you'll be fine when you don't feel fine, how does that make you feel?" "Like they're lying," said Pip quietly. "Or like we're broken for not being fine yet." "Exactly. So instead, I tell you that not being fine after something terrible happens is completely normal, and then we figure out how to be not fine in a way that doesn't make everything worse." The observation deck had gone very quiet. "Dr. Wells," came Dr. Vesa Andra's voice, "could you explain your theoretical framework for this approach?" "My theoretical framework is that lying to traumatized kids doesn't help them process trauma. It just teaches them that their emotional reality is invalid. But positive thinking approaches have shown positive thinking approaches work great for people who haven't just lived through the apocalypse. For people who have lived through the apocalypse, positive thinking approaches mostly teach them that adults are either idiots or liars." Nova looked up from his irony sculpture. "Bethany, are all humans as mean to adults as you are?" "Only the adults who deserve it." "How do you know which ones deserve it?" "The ones who try to explain to you why your feelings are wrong instead of acknowledging that your feelings make sense given what you've been through." The cubs were definitely getting more engaged. Over the past few days, they'd gone from catatonic trauma responses to actively participating in conversations about their situation. It wasn't traditional healing, but it was functional healing. "The subjects are demonstrating remarkable psychological resilience," Dr. Liskoth noted. "Recovery rates exceed all predictive models." "The subjects are demonstrating what happens when you treat traumatized kids like intelligent beings instead of broken objects," Bethany corrected. "But the content of their artistic expressions is deeply concerning," another voice added. "They are creating representations of death and violence. They are creating representations of their experience. Would you prefer they create representations of things that didn't happen to them?" Storm, who'd been quietly working on what looked like a diorama of the massacre, looked up from his project. "Bethany," he said, "why do the adults think we should pretend bad things didn't happen?" Because acknowledging that bad things happen means acknowledging that bad things could happen to them too, and that scares them. So they want us to lie? They want you to lie so they can feel better about the fact that they couldn't protect you. The observation deck had taken on the quality of a library where someone had just started reading aloud from banned books. That seems stupid, Orion observed. That seems very stupid, Bethany agreed, which is why we're not going to do it. Dr. Wells, came Kelthon's voice, tight with administrative panic. You are teaching the juveniles to question authority figures. I'm teaching the juveniles to question authority figures who want them to deny their own lived experience for the comfort of others. That could have significant social implications. That could have significant mental health benefits. The cubs had started making sounds that were definitely amusement. They were developing their own sense of humor about the absurdity of adults who wanted them to pretend their trauma didn't exist. The psychological observation team would like to schedule formal interviews with the subjects, Dr. Vesiandra announced. The psychological observation team can schedule all the interviews they want, but they're going to have to explain to 6 traumatized kids why their new approach is better than the one that's actually working. Our approaches are based on established therapeutic principles. Your approaches are based on making adults feel better about the existence of childhood trauma. There's a difference. Luna looked up from her existential dread sculpture. Bethany, if the adults' therapy is supposed to make us better, why does it make us feel worse? Because their therapy is designed to make you easier for them to deal with, not to actually help you process what you've been through. That seems like bad therapy. That seems like very bad therapy. The cubs were definitely developing a collective sense of humor about the situation. They'd started making their own observations about the absurdity of adults who wanted to help them by ignoring their actual experience. The ironic part, Nova said thoughtfully, is that they want to help us by telling us our feelings are wrong, but that's what made us feel broken in the first place. Now you're getting it, Bethany said. Meta-irony, the universe's favorite kind. From the observation deck came the sound of several psychological theories having nervous breakdowns. Dr. Wells, Kelthon's voice had taken on the quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing aggressive renovation. The cubs are laughing about their trauma. The cubs are developing a healthy psychological framework that allows them to acknowledge their trauma without being destroyed by it. But they're making jokes about death. They're making jokes about the absurdity of their situation. It's called gallows humor, and it's one of the most effective coping mechanisms humans have developed. Is that normal? Bethany looked at 6 apex predator cubs who were creating trauma art, questioning adult authority, and developing their own dark sense of humor about surviving the unsurvivable. For humans? Absolutely. For apex predator cubs who've been trained in human psychological resilience techniques. She paused. We're about to find out. And somewhere in the observation deck, a team of alien psychologists began frantically revising every theory they'd ever had about trauma recovery. 2 weeks after what the galactic media had dubbed the therapeutic incident, Bethany found herself sitting in the most surreal conference room in known space, surrounded by representatives from 43 species who all wanted to understand why human trauma recovery methods worked better than anything they'd developed in 3,000 years of civilization. The fundamental question, announced Chancellor Morthek of the Galactic Psychological Consortium, is whether human gallows humor protocols can be safely adapted for other species. The fundamental question, Bethany corrected, is why you're all so surprised that acknowledging reality works better than pretending it doesn't exist. Around the table, alien psychologists who had spent decades studying trauma were frantically taking notes on what they were calling Earth-based existential acceptance methodologies. Dr. Wells, said Professor Kesamiran from the Vorthak Institute of Mental Health, your approach has produced unprecedented recovery rates in post-traumatic subjects. My approach has produced kids who are functional instead of broken. It's not rocket science. Through the conference room's reinforced windows, she could see the cubs in their new living space, a facility that looked more like a home than a laboratory. They were engaged in what appeared to be a collaborative project involving building something out of scrap metal and having an animated discussion about structural engineering. The subjects demonstrate remarkable psychological resilience, Dr. Andra reported. They have developed coping mechanisms that allow them to discuss their traumatic experience without exhibiting stress responses. The subjects have learned that their trauma is part of their story, not the entire story, Bethany said, and that they're allowed to have feelings about it without having those feelings invalidate their worth as individuals. But they make jokes, said Dr. Liskoth, his tone suggesting this was somehow scandalous. About death, about violence, about their own near termination. They make jokes because humor is how humans process the incomprehensible. It's not disrespectful to their experience. It's proof that their experience hasn't destroyed their ability to find meaning in existence. The Cubs had finished their construction project and were now engaged in what looked suspiciously like a comedy routine, taking turns making observations that were causing the others to make sounds of obvious amusement. This behavioral adaptation concerns our military psychologists. Commander Zethkara joined the conversation via HoloLink. Subjects who can process trauma through humor may be more resistant to psychological warfare techniques. Subjects who can process trauma through humor may be psychologically healthier than subjects who pretend trauma doesn't affect them, Bethany replied. But the implications for combat effectiveness. The implications for mental health are that you get functional individuals instead of walking time bombs. If that interferes with your ability to use them as weapons, maybe examine your priorities. Her comm unit chose that moment to alert her to priority messages from 17 different universities, requesting collaboration on research projects, 12 military organizations wanting to implement human survivor training, and what appeared to be a marriage proposal from someone who found her approach to existential dread attractive. Dr. Wells, Chancellor Morthek continued, we need to understand the theoretical framework underlying your methods. The theoretical framework is that people who survive terrible things are still people, and people are allowed to have complex emotional responses to complex situations. But traditional therapeutic approaches emphasize emotional regulation and positive cognitive restructuring. Traditional therapeutic approaches emphasize making traumatized people easier for everyone else to deal with. There's a difference. Through the window, Nova appeared to be explaining something to the other Cubs, using gestures that suggested he was describing the conference room full of adults, trying to understand why their trauma recovery worked. The other Cubs found this hilarious. They are developing independent analytical frameworks, Professor Kesimiran observed, with what sounded like scientific fascination, mixed with horror. They critique adult therapeutic approaches using human psychological principles. They critique adult therapeutic approaches that don't work using logic and personal experience, Bethany corrected. Is this normal for human development? Teaching kids to think critically about whether adult advice is actually helpful? That should be normal for every species' development. Luna had joined Nova's explanation, apparently adding her own commentary about the adults' confusion regarding functional coping mechanisms. The group's amusement was becoming infectious. Even Pip was making sounds that were definitely laughter. Dr. Wells, came a new voice, Admiral Hayes from Terran Defense Command. We're receiving reports that multiple species are requesting immediate consultation on implementing human trauma recovery protocols for their military personnel. Their military personnel need therapy? Their military personnel need whatever technique makes soldiers psychologically resilient to combat trauma while maintaining operational effectiveness. Their military personnel need to be treated like human beings who are allowed to have emotional responses to traumatic experiences. Revolutionary concept, I know. The Cubs had moved on to what appeared to be impromptu theater, reenacting their interactions with various adult authority figures. Their impressions of the psychological evaluation team were particularly devastating. They are demonstrating remarkable emotional intelligence, Dr. Andra noted. They can identify and critique ineffective therapeutic approaches, while maintaining positive social bonds with each other. They are demonstrating what happens when you don't teach kids that their emotional responses are wrong, Bethany said. But some of their observations are quite cutting. Some of their observations are quite accurate. Adults who can't handle accurate observations from traumatized kids probably shouldn't be working with traumatized kids. Her comm unit buzzed with another priority alert. This one was from Administrator Kelthon, and it looked urgent. Dr. Wells, his voice carried undertones of panic. We need to discuss the circumstances of the original attack. What about them? New intelligence suggests the attack was not random. The cubs were specifically targeted. The conference room went dead silent. Targeted how? Their genetic markers indicate they are the offspring of specific breeding lines. The attack was designed to eliminate particular genetic combinations before they could reach reproductive maturity. Bethany felt something cold settle in her chest. Someone tried to commit selective genocide. Someone succeeded in committing selective genocide. These 6 individuals represent the only surviving examples of their genetic lineage. Through the window, she could see the cubs continuing their impromptu comedy show, blissfully unaware that they'd just become the last representatives of whatever genetic heritage someone had tried to eliminate. The implications are staggering, Chancellor Morthek said quietly. If these subjects represent unique genetic resources, if these subjects represent the survivors of attempted genocide, then making sure they're psychologically healthy enough to live meaningful lives becomes a lot more important than studying them like lab specimens. But the scientific value? The scientific value is that they're 6 kids who survived something terrible and learned to process it in healthy ways. Everything else is secondary. The cubs had noticed the change in atmosphere in the observation area. They'd stopped their performance and were looking toward the conference room with obvious concern. Dr. Wells, Admiral Hayes said carefully, if these individuals represent the sole survivors of a targeted genetic elimination campaign, their protection becomes a matter of galactic security. Their protection becomes a matter of basic decency. The galactic security angle is just a bonus. Nova approached the window and made a questioning gesture toward Bethany. She could see the intelligence in his amber eyes. He knew something had changed in the adults' discussion. The cubs will need to be informed, Professor Kesemiran said. The cubs will need to be informed in a way that doesn't traumatize them further, Bethany corrected. How do you tell children they are the last of their genetic line? Bethany looked at 6 apex predator cubs who had learned to process the unsurvivable through humor, honesty, and mutual support. The same way you tell them anything else that's true and difficult, she said. Honestly, with support, and with acknowledgement that it's okay to have complicated feelings about it. Storm had joined Nova at the window. They were having a quiet conversation that probably involved assessing whether the adults were about to make their lives more complicated. Dr. Wells, Kelthon's voice was tight with administrative anxiety. This information changes everything about their status and security requirements. This information confirms that they're survivors of something terrible who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Nothing else needs to change. But even as she said it, Bethany could see the gears turning in the minds of the assembled officials. 6 cubs had just transformed from interesting therapeutic subjects into invaluable genetic resources, and that transformation was going to make their lives infinitely more complicated. This is going to be a problem, she muttered. Through the window, all 6 cubs were now looking at the conference room with expressions that suggested they'd reached the same conclusion, and somewhere in the back of Bethany's mind, she began planning exactly how she was going to protect 6 kids from becoming specimens in a genetic preservation program. 6 months after what the academic journals were now calling the Wells Revolution in Trauma Psychology, Bethany stood in her new office aboard the Galactic Crisis Response Station, watching 6 apex predator teenagers teach a group of trauma survivors from 12 different species how to process apocalyptic experiences through strategic humor. The key principle, Nova was explaining to a group of shell-shocked refugees, is that acknowledging something is terrible doesn't make you weak, it makes you accurate. But what if acknowledging it makes you sad? Asked a young Centaurian whose home colony had just been destroyed by natural disaster. Then you're sad, Luna replied matter-of-factly. Sadness is a reasonable response to sad things. The universe doesn't owe you happiness just because you survived something. Bethany felt that familiar flutter of pride watching her former patients become teachers. They'd developed into confident young adults who could help others navigate trauma because they'd learned to navigate their own. Dr. Wells, came Administrator Kelthon's voice through the intercom. He'd been promoted to Director of Interspecies Mental Health Services and was still adjusting to the scope of his new responsibilities. The Galactic University Consortium has finalized their proposal. Let me guess. They want to establish the Bethany Wells Institute for Applied Disaster Psychology, the Bethany Wells Center for Existential Resilience Studies. They're offering unlimited funding and a staff of 300 researchers. They're offering to turn basic human decency into an academic industry. Through her office windows, she could see Storm demonstrating what he called constructive cynicism to a group of military personnel who'd been traumatized by combat. His approach involved acknowledging that war was inherently insane, while finding ways to maintain functional relationships with reality. The demand for human-trained trauma counselors has exceeded all projections, Kelthon continued. 17 species have implemented mandatory Earth-style grief processing in their healthcare systems. 17 species have implemented mandatory honesty about difficult experiences in their healthcare systems. The economic implications are staggering. Traditional therapy industries are being completely restructured. Traditional therapy industries are being forced to acknowledge that lying to people about their problems doesn't actually solve their problems. Her comm unit buzzed with the daily flood of consultation requests. Military organizations wanting to understand human psychological armor. Academic institutions studying Terran mortality acceptance protocols. Even a few marriage counselors who discovered that telling couples their problems were imaginary didn't improve relationships. Dr. Wells, came Chancellor Morthek's voice through a priority channel, we have a situation. Define situation. The Cubs have submitted a formal proposal to establish their own consulting firm. Bethany looked through the window at Pip, who was currently explaining to a group of disaster survivors that feeling overwhelmed by overwhelming situations was normal, and that pretending otherwise was stupid. They want to go into business? They want to establish Apex Survivor Solutions, trauma recovery for people who aren't idiots. That's a terrible business name. That's a direct quote from their marketing materials. The Cubs had finished their group session and were now engaged in what appeared to be business planning. They'd developed an approach to trauma counseling that combined apex predator directness with human psychological insight, and the results were apparently marketable. Their preliminary client list includes survivors from 43 different species, Kelthon reported. They're booked solid for the next 2 years. They're teenagers. They're teenagers with unique expertise in processing unsurvivable experiences who've been trained in human therapeutic methodologies. Orion approached her office door and knocked with the kind of polite persistence that suggested important business. Come in, she called. Bethany, he said seriously, we've been offered a contract to provide trauma counseling for the survivors of the Rigel Colony incident. The Rigel Colony incident involved 300,000 casualties. The Rigel Colony incident involved 300,000 people who need someone to tell them that surviving something terrible doesn't mean they're broken. She looked at 6 apex predator teenagers who had gone from scheduled genocide victims to in-demand trauma specialists in less than a year. You know this is insane, right? We know this is effective, Nova replied, and we know there are a lot of people who need effective help more than they need traditionally appropriate help. Besides, Luna added, we learned from the best, someone who treated our apocalypse like a paperwork problem, and somehow made us functional. I didn't treat your apocalypse like a paperwork problem. You treated our apocalypse like something that happened and then needed to be dealt with practically instead of something that defined our entire existence, Storm corrected. Which is basically the same thing. Her comm unit chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Hayes. Dr. Wells, we need to discuss your new job classification. I have a job classification. Galactic Crisis Response has created a new position. Director of Disaster Recovery Psychology. Congratulations on your promotion. I didn't apply for a promotion. You didn't apply for your current job either. But you've accidentally revolutionized how half the galaxy processes trauma. The Cubs were watching this conversation with obvious amusement. They'd learned to find humor in the fact that adults consistently treated normal human decency like advanced psychological theory. The ironic part, Pip observed, is that everyone's surprised that treating people like people works better than treating them like broken equipment. The ironic part, Bethany replied, is that I came here to clean up a mess and somehow became responsible for teaching an entire galaxy how to cope with messes. The universe has a sense of humor, Nova said solemnly. The universe has a terrible sense of humor. she corrected. But at least now we're in on the joke. Through her office windows, she could see the latest batch of trauma survivors arriving for processing. Natural disaster victims, war refugees, accident survivors. All people who needed someone to acknowledge that their experiences were real and that their responses were normal. "Dr. Wells," Kelthon said, "what should I tell the University Consortium about their research proposal?" Bethany looked at 6 apex predator teenagers who were planning to start their own trauma counseling business, then at the endless stream of beings who needed help processing the unsurvivable. "Tell them I'm busy. I've got actual work to do. And the job. Promotion? Fine. But I'm keeping my original job description, helping people clean up after really bad days." The Cubs were already heading back to their newest group of clients, carrying with them the revolutionary idea that surviving terrible things didn't make you special, broken, or blessed. It just made you someone who'd survived terrible things and deserved to be treated accordingly. And somewhere in the galactic administrative databases, a new job classification was being created. Disaster Recovery Specialist, defined as someone who treated apocalyptic events like particularly complicated paperwork and somehow made everyone feel better about existence. The universe, it turned out, really did have a sense of humor. It was just usually on the survivors.